Hi, I'm Paco Nathan with O'Reilly Media, and we're here at JupyterCon, and it's a pleasure to be speaking here with Matt Burton at University of Pittsburgh. And we were just talking a bit about some of your work you'll be presenting today. Some of you and your colleagues will be presenting today in Digital Humanities. Could you describe a bit more about this work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm very happy to kind of be here at JupyterCon to kind of represent the Digital Humanities community, which is maybe a slightly non-traditional community that's in this kind of open science, because we're not scientists, we're humanists. So I'm actually a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Information Culture and Data Stewardship, but within the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. So it's quite a long title, but essentially what it is I'm coming from I teach library science.
Oh, excellent.
And so libraries have a rich tradition with the humanities and supporting and helping the humanities do work. So that's kind of the research that I've been doing, is working on studying this community that has kind of emerged over the last decade called, or actually now almost 15 years, called the Digital Humanities, which actually has a much longer tradition dating back all the way to the 60s and 50s, which is humanities scholars who use computation to study human cultural artifacts. And so one of the really good examples that kind of makes sense for a lot of people is with the advent of digitization, we can now digitize books, and there's a digital library called the HathiTrust, which is essentially Google Books for scholars. And if you're in an academic institution, you can get access to this collection of 14 million books, which is a lot of books, and it's way too many for anyone to read individually, which is kind of the techniques, the methodology that most humanities scholars, especially literary historians or in literature, they usually read the books or they read a canon, which is a specific sampling of these books. But with the advent of digital collections and kind of concurrently with all the amazing work that's happening in machine learning and data science, now we can kind of combine all of this stuff together and do computational analysis over 14 million books, or do some sampling of all that sort of work. And so one of the work that I'm doing is I'm looking at and studying the work of some literary historians at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Ted Underwood and Jordan Sellers, what they've done is they've taken a collection of poetry volumes from the 19th century, and they built a classifier to understand and trying to understand the dynamics about what are the word features that might lead us to understand whether or not a poetry volume was reviewed or not reviewed. And so they have these, we're dealing with literary history, so there's a lot of information. We have these amazing training sets of things that we know and that we don't know about this stuff, so then we can now try and build computational models to gain better insight into these historic collections.
It strikes me that in many ways this is so applicable across a wide range of disciplines and domains, because we're contending with overwhelming amounts of knowledge collected over the years, but yet we're finding ways to make that human scale, to make it feasible, and really to use the tools and the augmentation, but bring back the problem to something that's human scale for a researcher.
Yeah, I think this is what the humanities brings, the digital humanities community specifically, but also humanities more broadly, is this, bringing it back to the questions of what does it all mean, and trying to kind of unpack and raise important questions, not just come up with an answer, but also kind of define the problem space and provide really interesting deeper level questions that penetrate into more of some of the critical aspects that we may not be necessarily paying attention to. And this is why I think the digital humanities community is really exciting, is because they're conversant in the language of machine learning and programming and data science, but they also have these rich experiences with history, with literature, and they kind of can do it all. And it's, I call it a community of unicorns, because they have all this wonderful stuff. But again, this community is also struggling with there's some tensions in the digital humanities with the digital humanities and traditional humanities, which is the same tensions that the open science community is dealing with, kind of more traditional science. Yeah. So publishing is a really hard problem for everybody,
Yeah.
not just the humanists, not just the scientists or the social scientists. And so some of the work that I'm doing specifically is trying to think about, so we have projects like Jupyter, which enable kind of multimodal computational narratives that are rich imbrications of text and prosaic text and code and data and visualizations. It's amazing, but it runs aground of kind of the traditional social and cultural processes of scholarly publishing, which have a very specific format that they like. If you want to submit to a journal, a lot of times it's
reduced to text.
It's a Microsoft Word document or a LaTeX if you're lucky. But a lot of times, most of the humanities is written in Microsoft Word, which is a great tool. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to pan it, but a lot of the work is headed towards a print-centric monograph, which is not a living thing. So now Digital Humanities, though, is working really hard. They build, they do a lot of work in digital scholarship. So they're creating websites, interactive data visualizations, and computational, work that has the code and data analysis in it. So how do you how are they publishing this stuff? And so what's currently happening is they, similar to science, they do the computational analysis, they produce a figure, and then that figure goes into a print PDF.
Yeah.
And so, but all the code that's associated with that, there's kind of the bespoke code that is part of that, and that's the stuff that's like kind of just disappearing into the ether because there's no place to put it unless they decide to throw it over the wall and put it up on GitHub.
Get on GitHub, yeah.
So, which that's some of the scholars do that. So this particular piece that I was talking about earlier by Ted Underwood and Jordan Sellers, they put their code up on GitHub. And so what I've done with my colleague, with some of my colleagues, is to actually start peer reviewing that code.
Oh, excellent.
And so we're coming up with a methodology that is used for peer reviewing the code associated, the bespoke code, the scripts, the glue code for computational data intensive digital humanities works. And so we're basically saying, well, now that we have Jupyter notebooks that allow us to kind of express this, but we don't have a method for reviewing it, and so we're kind of in the process, it's a work in progress for sure, in the process of making this new technique that we're called defactoring, that is essentially an approach to peer reviewing this code.
Wonderful, because just even getting to the point of having the code, the analysis, the text, the data, all of it published, that would be great, and it's still controversial in areas of science, which is what you wouldn't expect. But it's still not reproducible then, because, like you say, you have to go through a process to clean the data, and there has to be some kind of code. And unless you have agreement on what that process is and what the implications are, you could have all kinds of analysis on the other side coming out. You just tilt it whatever way you want based on how you clean up the data.
Yeah, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Right.
So, and this is
then deep learning.
And then there's deep learning. Oh yes, of course. Well, I don't even get me started on deep learning. That's going to be a very huge challenge for understanding reproducibility, or just for the digital humanities community. Reproducibility is not necessarily the most important thing for them, because the key is not coming up with a specific answer about in this case coming up with the best classifier for determining whether a poetry volume was reviewed. Their interest is, can we build a computational model and then interrogate that model to gain a deeper understanding of what words were used, or get a better understanding of the literature itself.
Sure.
So for them, they're interested in some of the same things that the reproducible science community is interested in the sense of like having that workflow, having those processes, making that all of that work transparent, but not necessarily for the efforts of reproducibility, although I do think that reproducibility will be an important thing for that community, especially when they start making, if people are going to make some major claims about, genre, or what the current, make some bold claims about what we understand about literary history. But another really important thing is just the decisions that you make when you're doing your data cleaning can greatly affect the output. And so, the interpretation that they might have, they're using just very basic bag of words, and they're picking the top 3,200 word features, and there might be, that people need to know that in order to understand their interpretation and their analysis, and they might then they might say, well, we're going to do it a different way, and we're going to, instead of using logistic regression, we're going to use some other classifier, and so that, it's more, instead of just replicating their results, which is totally possible, right? You can just run their Python scripts and get the exact same figure, which is really great. But it's even more exciting when you think about, like, okay, what can we do? How can we even build upon this to get even deeper insights into this digital collection?
I mean, a case in point that we ran into, if you're making reports about a collection of documents, and people might assert that, well, there's 32,000 documents about deep learning, but then you go back and find out they use bag of words, which means they counted all the documents that had the word deep in it, and all the documents that had the word learning in it. They add them together, and hey, it's 32,000. So I think that we really have to have much more transparency into the data cleanup, into the model interpretability, and also just into the scoring. Even if the model is functioning in a transparent way, understanding the impact of what the model's scores say.
Yes. Yeah, this is exactly, and this is why, so what we're trying to do is like kind of get people thinking about peer reviewing the code and these workflows as if they were, in the same way that we peer review the articles, or maybe, even more, right? We can, this is what I think becomes really interesting is, by getting people thinking about reviewing these and peer reviewing them and reading them and starting all the way from taking the data, data cleaning, reshaping the data so that it fits. I call this process data fitness, which is getting your data in shape. Doing normalization, running the model. Then what do you do with looking at the model, scoring all these things. All of these pieces, we need to be going through it and following those chains and reviewing those chains, just like we do with the at least in the gold standard of peer review, where we review it and interrogate it. What's also really exciting, though, is we're using Jupyter notebooks to do this peer review. What's really cool about this, with the affordances of the Jupyter notebook, is we can run the process, but we don't have to run it and just see what comes out the other end. We can stop halfway through and say, well, what's going on in that data structure? And we can begin to interrogate components of it. So the peer review actually becomes an interactive kind of thing where you can begin to dive into components and intermediate representations of the data. And so this is one of the things that we did, is we started saying, like, we stopped the analysis halfway through, and then we had the state of the system, and we could begin to run, it's all sitting in a pandas data frame, so we just began generating histograms and plots and just saying, okay, well, what does this look like in the middle? Because the original analysis just went all the way through, and so didn't have that. So this is one of the cool things that, it's even more than peer reviewing, just sitting and reading and following citations. You can actually begin to interact with the workflow itself and begin to review it and have a dialogue with the computation that the scholars created.
Wonderful. One of the big themes that's coming out of the conference, I'm seeing, I spoke on, I believe that you're speaking along similar lines, and we've talked to some other presenters as well, is about human in the loop, and how this is evolving as a design pattern for organizing people and machines to work together. Clearly, computer science, electrical engineering, all the rest, we've focused on how the machines will do their part, and we keep iterating on that. But I think we've totally overlooked, how is it that humans contribute? I mean, we talk about user interface, but we don't talk really about, if somebody is interacting with a machine learning process at scale, how much can they contend with, or when can they jump in? And it's these human factors that we need to come back to the humanities for, to understand what's the guidance.
Yeah, this is definitely, I think, the humanities is always like, where are the people, where's the human? And so, this is why I want to bring humanists in dialogue with the computer scientists, with machine learning, with the engineering people. I have a mantra, which is augment, not automate.
Absolutely, yes.
Because I think, there is a space for people, and it will, and one of the things that the humanities does a really fantastic job of doing is revealing the fact that there actually is always a human in the loop, but sometimes they're invisible. And this is, one of the really important dynamics that we kind of forget, is like, there is a human there. There's always a human there.
Keeping transparency on that part.
Exactly. Thinking about, like, who's doing some of the work. There was a bunch of talks. I mean, we talked a lot about at the conference about maintenance, right? Yeah. Maintenance. Who is maintaining this work? There's a lot of invisible labor involved in maintaining open source projects, in maintaining, the repositories, and in all this work. And so even if we kind of talk about automating all these things, that all it takes is 5 minutes for humanists to kind of say, well, actually,
here's your bug.
We'll look at this and look and see who's going to fix this bug, who's going to do this work.
Yeah, even more.
Who's going to answer these questions? Who's going to resolve these GitHub issues? And so there always is a person in the loop as much as but the key is making them visible and giving them credit for their work.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I'm curious about is how does this come back into the broader scope of library science? It seems that, I think of libraries and I'm showing my age, but there's card catalogs. I guess probably these days we should just drop that and say that there's some terminal you can go to and look up things on the web. Mm-hmm. But there's this notion of cataloging and being able to look through, check the references, and it's still very much print-based or maybe video-based to some extent. But is library science having the dialogue now about how to work back and follow this chain of provenance that you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. This is librarians are actually at the forefront of preserving workflows, doing data preservation, and all the preservation that's going to be involved with this kind of next generation of open science that's being produced. So saving, there's librarians. Again, going back to this invisible work, librarians are working on this stuff and have been working on this stuff for years. And kind of quietly and diligently, drawing on the kind of the rich tradition that the library community has in terms of this notion of servicing and facilitating the production of knowledge within the communities that they serve. And so, sometimes that work is not necessarily given the credit that it's due, and sometimes librarians need to speak up a little bit louder. But they are actually working on a lot of really interesting work in terms of, it's moved from, it's not just cataloging anymore. Now it's linked open data and metadata standards that allow you to create semantically rich descriptions of a scientific workflow. And that's, we're working on that. We've got tools and technologies for doing that. And we're ready for people to use it.
Well, fantastic. I mean, I work with AI apps internally at O'Reilly, and, with thousands of enterprise organizations using learning materials. That's the hard part, is actually that linked data and the semantic annotations, and how can we get that out into customers, even with all the machine learning tools we have. That's the bottleneck.
Yep. Yeah, I think that there's some really, there's a lot of really interesting work happening in digital libraries community around this stuff that, it's mainly focusing on the science community, but I think it has applications much more broadly. I think that the library community sometimes it has a marketing problem in the sense that they just need to, they need to kind of advocate for themselves. And, I think I would say to O'Reilly, hire more librarians.
Right, exactly. I'm all for that.
And so I would say, look to communities like the information schools. So library schools and library science is kind of undergoing a process of transformation, and where we are, for instance, where I'm at the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. It's an information school, and so we're not necessarily, we're a library school and we have a library program, but we're also an information school, and so there's a whole community of academic institutions, of departments and schools across the world called iSchools that have people working on these problems. And so I would say people should go look to those communities to find people who are working on this stuff, because I think that's where you'll find the people that you need.
Well, if somebody, say they have some background in machine learning, but they're hearing about this and they're saying, okay, I'd like to get involved, and they don't know about this particular community or related communities, are there conferences or online forums or anything you could point people toward as like a sort of a point of contact?
So there's the so for the iSchools, we have our conference called the iConference. Of course, we came about in the mid-90s, so it was iMac, iPhone, iSchools. And so there's the iConference, which is a community where the academic community comes to present their research. Specifically with like kind of some of the stuff you were talking about in terms of like semantic workflows and linked open data. There's the Joint Conference on Digital Libraries, JCDL, which has a lot of really good papers. That's an ACM conference, I think. There's there's a library community, a library conference called the Digital Library Federation Forum, or the DLF Forum, which is going to be actually in my hometown in Pittsburgh this year in 2017.
Oh, great.
But that's a community of digital librarians who are kind of working, doing all this stuff. They work on, reproducible science, open data, research data management, digital humanities. So the library community is kind of touching on all aspects of this, because the libraries, especially academic libraries, and this is not even to talk about public libraries, which is a whole other community working on this stuff. But academic libraries are, they service every aspect of the academy, from the sciences to the social sciences, the humanities, and they have really great work on all these areas. So I would say those are some conferences to check out for anyone who's interested.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. This has been great.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Okay. Good. Thank you. I know